Hello and welcome to another episode of Bidishanomics, where our consulting editor for economics, Dr. Bidisha Bhattacharya, takes your questions, dear viewers, on the global economy, India's position, and everything that comes our way. We have quite a few interesting questions. Bidisha, as always, I'll start with Anubhav Saxena's question first on the current account deficit. He's asking, the current account deficit has decreased while unemployment rate has increased. How does it show the fundamentals of Indian economy, and which are the priority areas government is or should work on to increase employment in the country?
This is quite an interesting question because it would help us delve deeper into the difference between stability and inclusiveness. Right. First, it's important to understand what do we mean by current account deficit. Right. Current account deficit is basically the gap between what we spend and what we earn, with respect to the world. Now, he is very right that the current account deficit has been improving. First, let's understand why it is improving. Now, there can be multiple reasons for it. The first reason being that exports are strengthening. Okay. Now, there can be multiple reasons for it. India has been primarily right now focusing on trade diversification, specializing, climbing up that complexity ladder. Even investing more in semiconductors, different other sectors that they didn't earlier. The other thing that can happen is the import prices might fall. Okay. In that perspective, because the import bill goes down, the current account deficit improves. And then, of course, there is another one where, from the exchange rate perspective or remittances perspective, there are stable remittances that are taking place. So now, these are the main reasons why the current account deficit might be improving. Now, as a result of which, of course, India becomes less vulnerable to global shocks. India becomes less volatile to capital inflows. Now it's important to delve deeper into, and we have in other ways discussed about this in previous episodes, to look at the internal domestic situation of the Indian economy, where we are seeing that the unemployment is still high. Now, what is the reason for it? Because if your current account deficit is improving, technically that means that growth will improve. And if growth improves, as we've studied in economics textbooks, unemployment as a factor would also do so. So, in this particular situation, it's important to understand that the sectors that are driving current account deficit improvement are not necessarily the same sectors that create mass employment. So this is what is taking place. Let's say, for instance, what are the areas that are driving current account deficit improvement? When I said export strength, I'm talking about from the perspective of IT and services exports. When I'm talking about stable remittances, these are areas, of course, that contribute to growth, but they don't necessarily generate large amount of jobs. Right. Now, what generates large amount of jobs or are embedded in the domestic ecosystem? This is the manufacturing area. This is, of course, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, and this is where MSMEs kind of become the central idea as to where should policy focus on. Then, in that particular situation, I have written. My latest column is about this particular understanding as to why are MSMEs not being focused on as much as they should be at this point in time.
And we'll link that for you to read.
Yes, definitely. So now what's happening is, historically, every time the government has reached out to help MSMEs, it has been kind of a crisis rescue cycle, and MSMEs have gotten stuck in this loop. Right. How? I'll tell you, because the focus has always been, for instance, providing credit, providing guarantees. Whenever there's a geopolitical crisis or there is a war-like situation, the government steps in to help MSMEs. Now, why do they help MSMEs? Why are MSMEs so important? They contribute 30% approximately to India's GDP and approximately 45 to 46% to India's exports. So this is not really a marginal sector. Right. This is a very important area. However, because of the way policies are designed around MSMEs, they are not being able to move from a fragile, vulnerable position to more of a structural reform position. Now, what needs to be done? Usually, what happens whenever there is no crisis situation, the GST refunds. Now, MSMEs rely a lot on GST refunds because they have to pay salaries to their employees. Secondly, what happens, labor market reforms, or we have definitely simplified the labor laws, or multiple laws into the 4 labor codes. However, implementation of that is still uneven, as a result of which there's a lot of uncertainty around these
Right.
MSMEs, especially the micro and the small enterprises. If even if they plan to scale, because of this uncertainty, because of this non-predictability, let's say, of inflows or flows, as a result of which they cannot really scale, they cannot really plan to scale, because they don't know. Sometimes what happens, there are a lot of small industries or micro industries who get demands or orders on a seasonal basis, not on a regular basis. At that point in time, government has to step in and incentivize them on from the social safety net point of view, or specifically, providing certain guarantees on from a structural basis, not a crisis basis. So this is where I believe delayed payments or delayed GST refunds, or digitized flows. There is also a big labor market challenge from the marginal cost point of view, because if any small or medium enterprise or micro business, they are asked to adhere to specific regulation or strict contracts, in that particular situation they will have to stick to the labor laws, they will
Right.
have to stick to minimum wages and different other regulations, which would increase their costs.
Okay.
And as a result of which, any which way they have very thin, they operate on very thin margins, that would reduce their profit even further. So they find, like, they basically choose fragility over formalization because that's more convenient, and they earn more money choosing fragility, which is why there's a lot of informality that exists, informal jobs, contractual based work, and not full-time work,
Right.
not providing that stability to workers, because even businesses don't know if they would be lasting for long.
Right.
So these are the areas that need to be looked into, and he is Anubhav, you're absolutely right when you said that the current account deficit is improving but unemployment is rising, and this is a classic example of the structural imbalance of
Right.
growth that we talk about, that externally we might look stable, but internally we are uneven, we are fragile in certain areas, and that uniformity, in order to bring that uniformity, the manufacturing or MSME bit needs to be strengthened.
Right, right. Bidisha, another churning that we're seeing in another industry is the tech industry.
Yeah.
And Srijan Rawat has sent a question on that. So they're asking, recently there has been news that many tech companies are firing their employees and saying that it is to streamline their businesses. So will this be the new norm, where in the future even white collar jobs will get reduced? Is it not paradoxical if the smartest minds in the world are trying to improve their profits by hyper focusing on using AI and reducing human labor? Then if no one is left with a job, how will anyone buy anything?
Very interesting question. This is not just a concern right now, it's one of the central economic tensions in the AI era, as we would like to call it. Now, first, let's understand what's exactly happening. There are these major companies, let's say, for instance, Snap Incorporated, which basically runs Snapchat. Then there's Block, and then there's Atlassian, who basically, have developed platforms like Jira, Jira, which is used by developers. Then, of course, you have the Meta platform, parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. So what all these companies are doing is that they are laying off workers. They are giving the justification or the reason that they are resorting to more of AI usage, and they are focusing or transitioning or restructuring rather to smaller, more efficient teams. As a result of which, AI is coming across as the most important or the actual reason for these layoffs that are taking place. Is that the reality? I don't think so. Historically, if we look at data, there are other multiple reasons why layoffs are taking place. Number one being, during the COVID period, overhiring had taken place. As a result of which, these layoffs that are happening right now, to an extent, is a result of that. Secondly, in earlier episodes we had discussed about this, that US dollar is considered as a safe haven asset, and as a result of which, a lot of investors are parking their funds in US treasury bonds, and so there is a lot of pressure from investors to increase profit. as a result of which this layoff is taking place. And the third reason, of course, is, enhancing the profit at a period when there is globally lower growth.
Right.
The growth is quite slow or low, and inflation is high, given the tensions in the Middle East or geopolitical tensions in general, which is why it gets even more difficult for companies or any brand, for that matter, even to scale. Now comes an important point, which he has mentioned rightly in his question, about the income consumption cycle, as we call it in economics, where people earn income and they use that income to spend money, and as they spend money, that makes businesses earn revenue and they expand and they hire more people. They of course they start earning more money, and automatically the economy starts growing and developing and aggregate demand increases. Now, if innovation is taking place but people are losing their jobs, then who will buy things?
Right.
That's very right. Now, of course, this is a question, and I feel that this is a very important discussion that we should continuously keep having, because nobody seems to have an answer across the world. There are multiple articles, but nobody seems to have an answer across the world as to what is the solution, what is exactly going to happen. So feel free to ask follow-up questions even in the comment section, or if for the next upcoming episodes as well, and we would love to answer them. So now, looking at from that perspective, there will be an evolution in the kind of jobs that would emerge. There'll be new kinds of data analysts, or AI engineers that would be coming, into the fore. And of course, the kind of jobs that are there in these brackets would probably be replaced. Coming to the second bit, which every government should focus on at this point in time, is invest a lot and incentivize human jobs. Now, there are certain jobs that AI cannot easily replace or immediately replace. For instance, healthcare, teaching, certain personal services. Now, these are the areas that the government needs to incentivize more, which is why, I had highlighted this earlier as well. This is after quite a while we are sitting in a particular global situation where monetary policy is not playing the main role. It's going to be fiscal policy, be it from an exchange rate perspective, interest rate perspective, inflation perspective. Central banks have given their 100%. So has RBI or Fed, for that matter. But this is where the government has to enter into the picture and make certain changes. So incentivizing or promoting and encouraging growth in these areas, human jobs, healthcare, teaching, personal services, and also, of course, will there be a middle class crisis? We don't know yet, but it's going to be a little difficult for the middle class. And all these solutions or pointers I'm mentioning based on history. This is not the first time that such transformation or restructuring is taking place. Even when computers were, created for the first time, the kind of jobs that emerged and evolved over time, there was a transformation, and there have been things in the past in history. And looking into those situations or the historical evolution line, this is what I can think of. But specifically, will there be a complete job loss? Because it's also important to understand, which is not being extensively discussed about, is that costs will fall. Because right now, every company is thinking that why should I hire 10 people when 3 plus AI can do the same job for me? As a result of which, in general, the costs will fall. If the cost falls, technically it trickles onto the consumer, so the prices will fall. So as a result of which, my income might not increase, but my purchasing power might increase. So this is also an area that we need to look into, that it's not just that because people will lose their jobs, but the purchasing power might also increase, as a result of which the demand might not immediately fall. So yeah, rest of course we will look into, but of course immediately these are the risks that we can think of.
Yeah. Now, Bidisha, we were just talking about how the government needs to respond to certain changes that are happening. Now, Sunil is asking a question on that, and they're referencing what's happening in Bangladesh, which is that Bangladesh is set to graduate from least developed country in 2026, this year. Now, they're asking, does India stand to gain from this, especially our textile industry, and is the government of India making the right moves?
Yeah. Of course, I mean, first, let's understand what does this LDC graduation mean, right? So, rightfully so, Bangladesh is set to graduate from this least developed country category under the United Nations framework. The date that has been specified so far in every report is around November 2026. Um, Now, it's important to understand what happens to any country that graduates from an LDC category. Of course, there will be a gradual loss of duty-free access. There will be a loss of preferential tariffs. Now, these are the two indicators or parameters that have been responsible and a key pillar for this huge and expanding Bangladesh's export potential, especially in the garment sector. So now what happens in this particular situation, it's important to also talk about two specific indices. I'll talk about them one after the other. The first one that we need to talk about is the export concentration. Of course, India stands to benefit, or any other competitor for that matter, in the textile or the garment sector stands to benefit. But when it comes to garments, Bangladesh has scale. Bangladesh has a strong domestic ecosystem, strong global supply chains, and when it will lose preferential tariffs, especially in markets, for instance, EU, there will be a certain amount of loss that they would have to incur. Now, here it's also important to understand that Bangladesh's exports are highly concentrated only in one sector. And here is where the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which in economics or in general, even in finance or trade for that matter, kind of calculates or figures out how much concentrated is every economy's export. Now, Bangladesh, if just to give an example, if the HHI index is low, that means that particular country is exporting diversified products, different products, not just one, and specializing in more. However, if the HHI is quite high, which is the case for Bangladesh, that means they are specializing in the production or exporting in one particular product or one particular sector, which is the garment sector in this particular case. Now, why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about HHI? Because any economy that has high HHI are more vulnerable to global shocks. Tomorrow, if there's any war that is taking place that hits the textile sector, Bangladesh will be impacted terribly, right? In this particular situation, of course, India is at an advantageous position because India is more diversified, rather I would say, and has a lower HHI compared to Bangladesh. Why so? Not only are we, majoring or specializing in cotton textiles, but also technical textiles. Now, before you ask what technical textiles are, these are sort of engineered, high processed fibers which are used for certain industries, let's say healthcare, aerospace, automotive, parts, these areas to be specific, and they are sort of, heat resistant, there is chemical protection. So these are the areas where India specializes as well. Now, this also kind of keeps India in a more advantageous position as a neighbor or as a competitor for that matter, because our domestic ecosystem is strong, there is scale, there is skilled workforce in that area which needs to be specialized even further. Now comes another index that we need to talk about, and I have extensively talked about in the past, which is the Product Complexity Index, or PCI. Now, why are we talking about PCI here? It's important to understand because PCI basically tells us how knowledge intensive is that economy, the kind of products that are being produced and exported across, and what is the plan. Are they climbing across that ladder, or are they stuck? Now, when an economy is exporting products that can be easily imitated, replicable, other sort of economies can copy and also export the same kind of product, these are the low PCI products. When it comes to textiles, when it comes to garments, these fall under the low to medium complexity. obviously from this problem itself generates another problem. If a product is easy to replicate by any other economies, zahir si baat hai, the competition will be very high. Now when the competition will be very high, it's important to understand here the competition will be happening on the basis of cost, not on the basis of innovation. However, if a country is specializing in, let's say, electronics, semiconductors, machinery, different automobile parts for that matter, then they are having a high PCI, and they are not in as vulnerable a position as an economy with low to medium complexity is. So Bangladesh stands to be vulnerable to these competition as well. Now coming to, of course, we've spoken about, okay, India has an advantageous position, but we need to be realistic here. Because when it comes to textile sector, India is not only competing with Bangladesh, India is competing with Vietnam, it is competing with Cambodia. Cambodia has a brilliant footwear industry, and Indonesia as well. All of these have better trade agreements, they have more efficiency in some way or the other. India, of course, has scale. India also has a domestic ecosystem, but it does not have as big a scale as Bangladesh does. India does not have as much of an efficient system as much as Vietnam does, for that matter. Now, how can we improve in these areas? Of course, one, India is India, firstly, let's understand, is India focusing on these areas? Is there any policy focus? Yes, there is. First, India is focusing on the production linked incentives. Different fibers, man-made fibers, skilling in these areas, working and investing in these areas have been happening. Secondly, free trade agreements. India has already finalized FTAs with UK, EU. There are also talks with UAE, Australia. Of course, tariffs do affect competitiveness in some way or the other. And third comes, of course, focusing on, these targeted guarantees or credits that are being given to MSMEs, because textile sector in general is dominated by MSMEs. So that is an area that India is investing in. But of course, as I have earlier spoken, I wouldn't repeat here, but in order to increase predictability, credit is not enough. Liquidity is important. In order to increase liquidity, there have to be timely payments. There have to be predictability and stability into the entire system of MSMEs for, structural transformation altogether.
So, Bidisha, the next question is by Manik Kapoor. They're asking the question in context of contractual labor. They're saying these labor contractors decide the rates of unskilled labor. Difficult to implement labor laws in India for SMEs. How can the government help the SMEs in this case?
So, of course, it's a no-brainer, and it's prevalent around and evident to everybody that contractual labor exists. And in the previous question, Sabika, we have discussed as to why contractual labor exists, because given the circumstances, it's very easy to blame firms, it's very easy to blame businesses, but given the circumstances, any firm would prefer moving in the path of fragility than moving towards a firm formalization, because they are not as passionate or for long-term growth or reducing long-term uncertainty, for that matter. So what happens is, when we have short-term benefits that they receive, of course, one being that because they don't have to, if they resort to, these informal jobs and hiring contractual labor, they do not have to comply with certain labor laws, labor codes, certain regulations, and as a result of which, or even minimum wages for that matter, or the number of days, that a person can work, and firing, hiring, all of that, all the regulations. In that process, of course, they reduce their costs, their margins are maintained. They any which way, MSMEs operate on thin margins, so their profits, they earn more profits, and also at the same time, they avoid certain costs that could have reduced their margins. Now, as a result of which, what needs to be done, stability and of course uncertainty needs to be removed from the system. How can uncertainty be removed from the system? That's where the government has to step in. The government has to encourage, if the government knows that contractual labor exists or contractors exist, why not formalize that system? Why not record it and make it streamlined, so that workers are getting their wages in a particular bracket on time. And even for workers as well, they should not be dependent on one employer, because then there's a monopoly kind of a situation where exploitation also comes into the picture. This is the government's, the policy focus and responsibility, rightly so, to enhance these incentives and pay the right kind of, or streamline the welfare schemes in a way
Maybe
that the
codify
workers,
the system better.
100%, absolutely. And also sort of reduce this inefficiency, short-term inefficiency, so that even employers or firms are incentivized to move to a formalization structure, to a formal structure, follow these rules. And as a result, we have the data as well in place to understand the growth, the development in these sectors.
Right. Now, Bidisha, because of everything that's happening, and of course, the Hormuz was reopened last night, but crude has been in the focus and crude prices have been in the focus. And with that, I'll ask the last question of this episode, which is by Bluetooth X6W. They're saying that they're confused about crude future or crude in itself, because the prices which they see on the internet might be $90 per barrel, but the actual price of landing of crude is $120 per barrel. So what's happening? Just throw some light.
Right. So what we are seeing, or what you are seeing in terms of prices, are different layers of this price mechanism that oil or any input goes through. So I will try to break this down. It's important to understand that there are two kinds of prices that, especially in terms of this question, we can discuss on. One is the benchmark price and the other is the transaction price. First, let's talk about the benchmark price. The benchmark price is the price that is set by the market, keeping in mind demand, supply, expectations, or certain targets for that matter by the market. And let's take the same number, $90 for that matter. There are two kinds of these benchmarks: the Brent crude oil and the WTI crude oil. The Brent crude oil is focused on by Europe, Middle East, and also Asia for that matter. The WTI crude oil, which is the West Texas Intermediate, is something that is looked at by the US markets specifically. So let's say, for instance, that $90 has been set as the benchmark price. Now, what is the difference between this and what ultimately gets paid? Let's say, for instance, now this oil oil travels kilometers in tankers, right? So there is freight cost involved, there are shipping costs, port handling costs involved. So if we incorporate that cost first, the $90 will increase to, let's say, $93 to $95, right? Then comes insurance cost, because sometimes oil passes through very sensitive regions. Let's take the Strait of Hormuz, for example, now. So when there is an insurance cost, insurance or risk premium kind of involved, that again increases the cost, and now say it has increased to $95 to $98, right? After that, there's also certain refinement. Now, not all oil is equal. There are certain oil that, one kind of oil that does not require refining as such, and that is the cheaper variety. Then there is the kind of oil that would require more processing, and of course automatically it would be categorized as premium and the cost would increase there. The cost becomes different for both kinds. Then another thing, oil is a commodity that is not purchased like daily groceries. Right. So countries sometimes, of course, they make an agreement, they purchase large quantities from a particular country, so there is discounts involved. There are premiums involved accordingly. So these are the costs that increase to ultimately the $120 or the $100 or $110 that you're seeing. Now, there is a common misconception that takes place here, because a lot of people think that taxes also are a part of this jump. That's not true. Excise duty or VAT comes only into the picture when crude becomes petrol or crude becomes diesel.
Right.
That's when tax enters into the picture, which is why you will see that fuel prices look even more expensive compared to the oil price. So this is predominantly nothing but, the concept in economics that we see of price transmission altogether, where the price moves through the system and as a result of which costs get added up, and hence you see a much more elevated price compared to the $90.
Right.
So that's...
Thank you so much for simplifying that. Even I didn't know about that. Thank you, Bidisha, for answering the questions and elaborating so well. Thank you, viewers, for watching. We're looking forward to your questions for next week, and we'll be back with another episode of Bidishanomics.